Hello and welcome to Coronavirus Capitalism, a special podcast series from the Socialist Party. In the coming days and weeks, we'll be talking about the unfolding crisis sparked by COVID-19, the novel virus at the centre of the most serious social health emergency in generations. We'll analyse the turmoil besetting the capitalist system, with businesses in many sectors as well as major airlines going bust, and thousands of workers losing their jobs and losing pay. We'll examine the measures taken by governments nationally and internationally in response to the spread of the virus and the threat it poses to their economic system. We'll be asking the most important questions. What does this mean for working class people? And how do we make sure that we aren't made to pay the price? We're joined remotely by Chris Stewart. Chris is a member of the Unite Irish Executive Committee and an activist with the Unite Hospitality NI branch. He's speaking today in a personal capacity. Hello, Chris.
Hey, yep.
And also joining us on Skype is Amy Ferguson. Amy is a hospitality worker and is also on the Unite Hospitality branch committee. She's also speaking in a personal capacity. Hi, Amy.
Hey, yep.
And my name's Eleanor Crossy Malone. I'm a member of the Socialist Party and an organiser with Rosa NI, Socialist Feminist Movement. Chris and Amy, thank you for taking time to appear on this podcast. I know you've had an incredibly busy week and we're about to get into the reasons for that. So first of all, Boris Johnson has issued a recommendation to avoid all unnecessary contact with other people. And yet there were no definite measures being taken to ensure that non-essential businesses and services would actually close. They weren't ordered to close. Hundreds of scientists around the UK have signed a letter to say that the government's laissez-faire approach is risking lives. So is it putting workers at risk, Chris?
Yes, absolutely. I think all the science shows just how contagious this virus is. Scientists are calling for shutdown measures to be taken in non-essential workplaces, and I think with hospitality especially, where the job is public facing, dealing with a lot of customers throughout the day, dealing with cash, handling a lot of cash which can carry germs, dealing with food and drink, it really is essential that measures are taken to shut down the non-essential parts of the industry in the interest of health. And in reality, this is a political decision that has been made by the Tories in order to not harm big business, putting the profit of these companies ahead of not only the health of the workers in question in these workplaces, but also public health generally, because the failure to take adequate shutdown measures will have inevitably led to a situation where the virus has been allowed to spread. And I think what we saw on St. Paddy's Day, for example, where you had, in Belfast, employers demonstrating a complete disregard for the safety of their staff and their customers, and employers promoting events all over the city, effectively ignoring any sort of social distancing advice. Some employers were even, requesting their employees come in as volunteers, so not getting paid, but putting their own health at risk for the bottom line of the employer. So I think it was good that we saw a number of workers actually taking action against this, and they're supported by the Unite Hospitality branch in going around and protesting these workplaces, making the point that a worker's health should be put first, but also in places that did end up closing, making and laying off staff, like Boojum, making the point that they should be paying their staff. It's absolutely ridiculous that there be a situation where staff will be left out of pocket and suddenly laid off.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, I think any hospitality worker will recognise and will know this, but I mean, we work in such close, especially bartenders and that, we work at such close proximity to each other that, see, when it comes to the winter months, if one of your co-workers gets even a cold, you're going to have that cold by the end of the week, and just to see the reality of what conditions bars were forcing people to work in, even this week on the run up to St. Paddy's Day, there was a bar who by the Monday didn't have hot water, warm running water for staff to wash their hands in. And when you consider as well, a big strategy for bars, right, is to bump up the temperatures. Where you go to a bar, they'll have the thermostat up to 26 degrees. Like, people are sweating all over the place, coming up, ordering drinks, shouting in your face, leaning over the bar. You're then having to go clean up after them, etc. Like, just the conditions in the bars themselves are rife for spreading these sort of infections, you know.
The government has asked businesses to close voluntarily, while the Tory Chancellor Rishi Sunak recently announced plans for £330 billion worth of business loans in an attempt to keep British capitalism afloat. What do you make of this? What does it mean for the workers? And maybe you can tell us what workers are experiencing now in the hospitality industry in relation to job losses and loss of pay.
Yeah, I mean, this multi-billion pound package that the Tories have announced, there's absolutely no stipulations added to that said that workers, that should go into the pockets of workers. I mean, the reality is that, like, the bosses have money to tide them over and more for the next coming period. Yet it's them that will be the beneficiaries of such a package, including those who have already laid off their staff to avoid any sort of financial responsibility for them. Some workers are saying, oh, I mean, it's not the employer's fault, you know, we're all in this together. And they have this weird instinct to protect their employer. But I mean, why is that? Why are people doing this? I mean, when we consider the reality, a couple of the bosses and Hospitality Ulster just this year were boasting that it was their best January in a decade, that it was their best Valentine's week in a decade, and overall they'd just been on the radio constantly talking about the profitability of the sector and how that was growing. Yet I don't think a single worker in hospitality actually saw that rise of profits in our wage packets, which has meant that we do live payday to payday. And so we haven't had the ability to save, and we're now left with absolutely nothing to fall back on. That's not the case that the bosses are facing, yet we're the ones actually, you know, making that money that the bosses now get to live on while we're left with nothing. You know, we're the ones actually providing the service, actually on the ground doing the selling. People may act like it's the bosses and owners who create that value and wealth and who have a right to it. But I mean, look at the economic situation now. The economy is absolutely drawing to a halt because of the large number of working class people at the house, because it is working class people who have created this wealth and who allow the world to run yet. So at the end of the day, it's working class people who are more entitled than any to this bailout, to this $1 billion package. Yet thousands of us are facing no income at all. I mean, the queues to the Dole office are so big that people aren't going to be able to get advice until April 3rd, while landlords are knocking at their doors. You know, I've been approached with so many stories of people whose landlords have preemptively contacted them saying, do you still have a job? If not, we'll need to reconsider, you know, your place here.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the fact the government made this decision to bail out the bosses and not provide anything for workers is really indicative of how the capitalist system functions. Because, you know, for years we've heard from the Tories that there's no magic money tree, no money for health, no money to scrap tuition fees. And then now, what we're seeing is as soon as the bosses are in trouble, there's suddenly a magic money tree for them, and you've got this ridiculous situation now where companies like Biancore, the managing director of which, Bill Woolsey, made the decision to sack 800 workers in one go, and then now they're suddenly going to be getting bailed out. And I think from Biancore especially, we've seen, you know, the certain wringing of the hands from Bill Woolsey in the media, saying it's such an emotional time for him, an extremely tough decision to sack all his workers and leave them without a paycheck. But in reality, Biancore posted profits of 11.2 million in 2017-2018, so there is the money there. But I think for us, like, our first demand would be an immediate moratorium on layoffs and sackings. The fact that you have companies like Biancore sacking their workers and then being eligible for money from the state is absolutely despicable. But also, further than that, workers across the industry should be guaranteed their normal income, and workers should not be forced to pay for this crisis.
I mean, you can really see the complete disregard that these employers have for their staff. Now, I'm going to be deliberately vague in terms of the name of the employers, because I don't want the person who came to me with that story to get in trouble, because they literally are trying to, they're firing everyone on the spot. They'll send litigation letters to anyone they want. But for instance, there's a bar in Belfast who in the November, December months alone, based on their income and the contracts that they get, that they make enough money then to pay all their bills, all their wages for a year. We've had a chance to look at their books to determine that. Yet when one of their staff members raised the question of, okay, you've closed the bar, are we entitled to our wages? He was literally told by his manager to go to bed. That was the response.
Yeah, it's pretty shocking. One thing we've seen sort of plastered all over their social media pages recently has been a particular stunt, I would call it, by Boojum, where they brought burritos to very hard-working and heroic healthcare workers. And this was on the same day that they sacked a huge number of their staff. What's happening at Boojum right now? What's happening to the workers?
Yeah, the post on social media you're referring to there was actually made literally the day that they decided to lay off their workers and leave them without a source of income. So it was good to see workers both in and out of the union from Boojum in the comment section, letting people know what had happened and really calling out Boojum for this PR stunt that they were attempting. But I think even just the amount of people we've had coming to the union wanting to join, it is clear that not only Boojum workers who in the past have had the struggle even for health and safety to be taken seriously in the workplace through the union, but also across the industry, workers are starting to wake up to the reality of what precarious work is, because this quite starkly shows the stranglehold that bosses have over workers, the fact that basically overnight thousands of workers can lose their job. Like this just shows that really workers in this industry have absolutely no rights, and the bosses have literally that much control over us.
I think as well, it's Boojum are one of the main offenders of laying off all these staff and then claiming, oh, but we're, our hands are tied, we really just can't afford this. We can't afford to pay our staff. But I think in situations like that, we just have to say to them, well, if you can't afford to pay your staff, prove it, open your books, because it's the case where a lot of employers will try to do that. Will try to say that they don't have the money, that will try to say that, they'll try to shift the blame onto the government, try to shift people's anger away. And absolutely, it may be the case that some small businesses demonstrably cannot afford to pay their workers. And in that case, the state should come in to subsidise workers' pay, potentially, through an emergency tax on the super rich and big business. But we can't let such profitable employers like Boojum, like Biancourt, actually get away with this absolute, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to swear, but this absolute nonsense that they're peddling,
Mm-hmm. And I think what's happened with Boojum is actually an example of how, this could be, this is a local business that could avail potentially of one of these £330 billion business loans, and yet there's absolutely no guarantee that will translate into workers' jobs being secure, that it will in any way actually benefit workers and working class people. So I mean, that's an example of some of the thousands of job losses that have already happened, and thousands more workers are going to lose pay in the next period across many different sectors, but especially for those in precarious jobs and on 0-hour contracts. What's the best advice that you can give to workers right now who might be affected by this?
Yeah, I think a lot of hospitality workers in this situation will be feeling a lot of uncertainty and anxiety especially because in a lot of instances employers have provided next to no information, next to no clarity to their workers. So the first thing I would do is contact the union. We can provide support and advice. Our reps will be working and have been working around the clock to this end. We've also set up, if you type into Facebook, Hospitality Workers Mutual Support Group, a group to bring workers in the industry together to discuss what's going on in their workplaces, and crucially how we can fight back against this, because no matter what, we will be politically fighting this to ensure that hospitality workers are not thrown under the bus and not shafted.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, Unite has a lot of advice out there on the concrete, on what workers are and aren't entitled to. But I think, unfortunately, I mean, the law is never on a worker's side. So actually what laid off staff are entitled to is very, very little, essentially nothing at all. So considering that, I mean, my main piece of advice is to get organised, join a trade union, get together with your workmates, or by Zoom call, if considering safety in the circumstances, but get together with your workmates, have a conversation about what's happened to you, have a conversation about your situation, what you need, what we need to do going forward. I mean, ultimately, like, whilst hospitality workers and the hospitality sector has been so disorganized, workers in the sector have been so disorganized, it means that from our point now, we're all putting out confused messages, we're all putting out different ideas, and I think what we need to do concretely is come together, recognize that our bosses are very clearly organized in their interests. That's why, and they're getting multi-billion pound packages, but we're not getting anything, precisely because the employer can't just push us to a side whilst we're all acting as individuals. What we need to do is come together in a union and act as one cohesive block in this, just to demonstrate the value of a workforce coming together and recognising their interests. If we look at Harland and Wolff, when they were faced with their redundancies, they didn't just sit back and say, oh, well, I'm sure this is what's necessary, blah, blah, blah. What they said was, actually, no, we're being made redundant precisely because of corporate greed, precisely because our bosses just were thinking about their bank accounts. And what did they do? They occupied that factory until they were listened to, and they were. The Harland and Wolff workers are now all back in work. I think that's a very important and very practical point to show that the power that is in collective action, the power that is in you and your workmates actually getting together and fighting back, because the bosses ultimately don't even expect us to. I think as well, tied to this is a reality in the situation in that the organisations of working class people are particularly weak. Again, that I mentioned, the law is never on the side of working class people. The state is never on the side of working class people. They came in rallying behind the bosses in this, again, giving them $1 million packages. So I think what's clear generally is this fact that organisations for working class people to rally around and organisations that will work in the interest of working class people are severely lacking. I mean, I can't remember whether it was Connolly or Larkin, but they said that the working class movement, I'm going to paraphrase, but the working class movement has two fists. One is the trade unions and the other is our political representation. And without that political representation, essentially we have one hand tied behind our backs. And I think ultimately this crisis has laid bare the class relations within our system. I mean, the bosses aren't struggling. What's struggling? Working class people, the NHS, public services that have for decades been allowed to decay. So in that context, what we need to do is fight for working class representation in the political sphere. It's clear that the capitalist system is completely stacked against us, and we need to challenge that. We need to challenge that, I believe, through the existence of a revolutionary party, through a party for working class people with the aim of overthrowing this rigged system in favour of one which is run democratically by working class people who will put the interests, finally, of working class people of the planet first before the bank accounts of the super rich.
I think globally this coronavirus is really revealing the cruelty at the heart of the capitalist system, really. I mean, the fact that in essence, you know, in many different countries from Iran to the US to the UK, Ireland, Italy, wherever, the kind of first response in January of capitalist governments all around the world was to ignore this crisis, to not put any measures in order, because they feared harming the profits of big business. And then what we have seen now in response to the development of this situation has been that the stock markets have plummeted and capitalism is essentially collapsing itself, and laying off workers all over the world without pay. And I think really it's quite starkly for a lot of people revealing the fact that capitalism as a system just does not function for the need of people, and really pointing to the need for a socialist system based on what is actually needed, where we can put resources where human need demands them, and not where in the interests of the profits of a tiny few. So, I mean, the Socialist Party will be producing a number of podcasts and articles and social media posts in the coming days to try and explain this crisis as it develops over a period of months. And what I would say to people is, you know, we're having meetings over Zoom constantly and the like. If people do want to get involved, they absolutely should join the Socialist Party, join our movement, and help the fight for a better world across the globe, you know.
Yeah, I think actually, Chris, I mean, the point you made on international response is crucial. I mean, the Socialist Party is the Irish branch of the International Socialist Alternative, which is as the name suggests, an international socialist organisation. And I would too encourage people to reach out to us in the Socialist Party if they agree with what we've said, if they want to get involved in the socialist movement, but also if they have questions about politics generally. I mean, it's a very confusing time for people. We're seeing news updates left, right, and centre. So if you are struggling, if you're a working class person who's struggling and is just desperately looking for a way out, message us about getting involved, about seeing what options are in front of us.
I think just to end the podcast on a positive note, because this can obviously be a very anxious and gloomy period for people, but there is a shimmer of hope, because we are seeing worker struggle beginning to develop, in certain places like England, where bin workers won sick pay for those forced to self-isolate. In Italy, where Fiat workers have stopped their production line and said, we're not going to let management put the profits of this company ahead of our health any longer. Or even in places like Iraq, where we've seen protests develop over the past year. Protesters are giving lectures on the street themselves about the coronavirus and how to prevent it, giving out things like masks and gloves. And I think that's key here, because it is that spirit of working class solidarity and that power inherent in workers getting organised that is going to be able to overturn this capitalist system, and the rule of these companies for profit, and bring in a new world.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you, Amy.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks for having us.
We want to hear from you. Find Socialist Party NI on Facebook and follow us on Twitter at Socialist NI. For more news and analysis, or to donate, go to socialistpartyni.org.